Any better, Heather? What's going on? All right, man, it's good to be here this morning. Had a lovely ride over to Houston yesterday with some friends, and Josh and John and some others, and came back. And on the way back, I hit Nome, and we're turning on 365, come back this way, and I honked my horn at one of our people that we're splitting off from, and I hit honk and honk, but the second honk didn't honk. And I didn't think anything of it. I thought maybe I messed up, just missed the thumb, whatever. About a quarter mile down the road, I looked down at my instruments, and all my instruments were completely gone. Couldn't see a thing. I couldn't see speedometer, couldn't see gas, couldn't see gear, couldn't see anything. So I do it old school ways, feel the gear by the feel of the motor, and just hope I had enough gas to get me home. And found a short, had to fix it, fix the fuse, blew another fuse, got it all fixed. And I don't know, about 7 o'clock, 7:30, whatever, we finally got done and went home, and my bike's working now. So my thoughts all the way home from Nome to Josh's house was, I'm supposed to leave next Monday, not tomorrow, but a week from tomorrow, on my motorcycle trip to Arkansas. Can I rent a motorcycle if I need to? Because I know, my answer is yes, but my thought was, how much is it going to cost me and what I'm to do to get it, right? And I wasn't thinking like I wasn't going. I was thinking like I'm going. I was going to figure out how I'm going. Anyway. Oh, man. Well, we're going to lighten the mood a little bit today. The last few messages have been kind of heavy messages, heavy to teach, probably heavy to hear and absorb. But last week I mentioned Noah, and a few people commented to me about it, and some commented that they had learned something just by a quick statement I made. And I thought, well, that's kind of neat. And I remembered a message I had done way back in Kansas years ago. And it kind of said, oh, yeah, I remember I did the message. So I decided to kind of teach this story to you guys. It's a little bit different than I did in Kansas, but teach it to you because it's a story that's close to my heart because there's so many things about the story that really tell us about Jesus and the heart of God. And so for most of us, the story of Noah is about rain and animals and a big boat, right? A rainbow. But for some, the story of Noah reminds them of judgment, of wrath, of sin, the end times. And both of these are true because there's elements of all of that in the story of Noah. But it depends on how it was told to you as a child and how you remember it, as whether it's a big, scary story or whether it's a kind of a cute little story. And some of you parents maybe have done this before when you have your kids are young, or maybe your grandkids are young or whatever, and you want to decorate their nursery. You're like, let's decorate it in Noah, right? And you get these cute little boats with the giraffe sticking out the window, and everything's all like rainbow stuff, whatever. And you're like, oh, it's so cute, And then you realize that what's missing in that picture is millions of people floating on the water because they're dead. Yeah, not a really nice story to think about when you think about a nursery, right? Or all the animal carcasses decaying on the water, right? You missed that part of the story, right? And so when you put those things in perspective and you start thinking about like, wow, there wasn't really a beautiful scene in that aspect of the story of a nursery, right? But these are the things that people think about when we look at the story. But if you look at the event of the flood and you seek to understand it from God's perspective, you'll see these thoughts of rainbows and animals and a big boat and even the judgment really not the story at all. There are elements of the story, but that really isn't the focus of the story. So today we're going to have a little bit of fun and learn some facts about Noah all over again, maybe some new facts, right? And maybe learn a little bit from God's perspective, what he wants us to kind of learn from that. Now, we don't know much about Noah's life growing up. The story we see is listing off all these people, and the first account that we have is at the end of Genesis chapter 5, and he's already grown. In fact, he's 500 years old, and he has 3 sons, and his 3 sons are grown and are married. That's the first kind of introduction we have to Noah. We learn from the account in Genesis before that, in Genesis 5, that Methuselah, which would have been Noah's grandfather, lived 187 years before having a son. Now, Methuselah's name literally means death, or a dart or a missile or a projectile is sent. And the idea would be that he died before the judgment of God came. So interesting name to be given, right? That death did come right after he died. But he died at the age of 969 years old, the oldest recorded man to ever live. Now, his son that he had at the age of 187 was Lamech. Lamech, which means strong man, he was Noah's father. He lived 182 years before having a son, and he named his son Noah. Noah oddly means rest, or one of rest, something that Noah really never gets any of. Lamech lived 595 years after the birth of Noah and died at the age of 777, only 5 years before the flood. Now, these dates are interesting, and you go back and look at them, and you kind of put them together, and a couple of different reasons that kind of stand out with me understanding these dates and kind of fun to think about was it gives us some insight into the family dynamics of Noah, even without really knowing what Noah's life was like 500 years before we see it. But to kind of understand the family dynamics, that Adam, the first man, Adam, right, died only 126 years before Noah was born, right? Noah was the 10th generation after Adam. So think about the implications of this, right? Do you not think that Noah would have been told the story of Adam and Eve? Considering his father Lamech was alive and probably talked with Adam, right? We don't think about that when we look at the genealogy, but Adam was alive when Lamech, Noah's father, was born. In fact, I think he was 50 by the time when Adam died. So he probably heard the story from a very reliable source. People say all the time, they'll say, it's the story is passed on, passed on, passed on. But if I tell the story to one of my grandchildren and he tells it to his child, it's not passed on, passed on. It's like right there. It's not generation after generation after generation losing the story. It's one generation and there's the person telling the story. So it's kind of interesting to think about that Noah would have heard the story from his father Lamech and Methuselah, his grandfather, who lived most of his life with Adam alive. So it's kind of neat to think about that aspect and how he would have heard about God. Now it makes sense then that Noah was found righteous, right? Because he was around people that lived around God, around Adam and stuff like that. So, but then you look at the flip side. If all that was just right then, like a short amount of span of time, how did mankind get so corrupt, right? In the time of like 200 years after Adam lived to like the flood came. And you think about like, how did mankind lose its goodness and its righteousness from that time? I mean, you look at the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain goes off and you're like, okay, well, Cain's family, he's all corrupt. But even Adam's family and the kids came after it, they end up all kind of being corrupt, except for the line of Methuselah, Lamech, and then Noah. So it does make you think like, wow, that's really a short bit of time. And then you start thinking about our country, right? Country is 400 something years old, right? I can see now how, we could kind of, get off kilter a little bit in that short amount of time, right? And so it doesn't take long for mankind to kind of get messed up and sort of going off in different directions. So we don't know a lot about Noah, but we can deduce something about his upbringing that God was taught at home. Being a very direct line to Adam and other great men of God, Noah would have taught how to walk with God. He understood the relationship he had with God and the relationship he had with the community of those who walked with God as well, with his father, with Methuselah, and those that were before him. He proclaimed that relationship to others around him. He knew God and began to tell others about God and the relationship that he had with God and the relationship that they should have with God. Not too many people listened, but he proclaimed it. This is why we do not see Noah even question God at all. Now think about this. You're off in the desert somewhere, minding your own business with the sheep, and God comes along and says, hey, start building me a big, huge boat, put all the animals in it. And you won't have to go gather them. They're just going to come to you, 2 by 2. And then I'm going to seal it up, and there's going to be a rain that could come, and the whole world's going to be flooded. And Noah says, okay. Right? Like, would that not be something that we would do? Like, God, let's have a discussion here. I mean, you look at the story of Moses. Moses was questioning God all the way along. Like, he gave God 15 different excuses why he wasn't going to do it. Noah just starts building a boat in the middle of the desert. Right? A boat that would never have been used that big before, if they had boats even, which I think probably did have some boats, but definitely not a boat that big. And he just went along and went, okay, I'm good. Right? This type of faith, the type of faith that when God says this, that he's going to do it, you just do it. That's some amazing faith. We can also deduce that Noah was already probably an accomplished woodworker. God gave him the directions to build the ark. He didn't need to teach him how to build or what tools to use. He said, here are the measurements and the material to use it for, but he didn't tell him how to use a hammer. Right? It wasn't like Noah was out there, feet up, and he said, I want to build. I don't even know how to use a saw, God. I don't know how to drill. So most likely he already had those skills. Most likely because God probably put him in a place where he could use those skills. And now he's able to build this ark, right, with those skills that he had. Based on the reading of Genesis 6 and 7, we can gather that God probably gave him some pretty detailed blueprints, so to speak. But he most likely already had the experience of woodworking. Now, we don't even know his wife's name. Everywhere in the Bible, you just see Noah's wife. Like, sorry, Noah's wife, you're the mother almost of all mankind, and you don't get the name mentioned, right? So, quick overview of some facts of the flood event. Just kind of think about this. At the age of 500 years old, Noah became a father for the first time, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This may have been the result of having triplets, some commentaries have alluded to. But if you go back and look at the ages, and you can see some other things in other scriptures, whatever, I don't believe that they were triplets. I believe that they were born in succession. Doesn't mean at 500 he had kids. It may have been at 500 he began having kids. But based on this and other evidence, I've come up with that Japheth was Noah's oldest son. He was born at 500. Shem was born second, and when Noah was 503, and Ham was Noah's youngest son. And so Noah's sons are always listed as Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But the birth order would have been Japheth, Shem, and Ham. And so it's interesting when we think about that, why would God do it that way? Why isn't the Bible always done Shem, Ham, and Japheth? Well, often in the Bible, you'll see the younger name mentioned first when they're more prominent in society or they're more prominent in the storyline of God. And so we see the line of Shem being the line where Christ came through from. And so when we see that, it makes sense that his name would be first. We see that throughout the Bible. Sometimes God doesn't even give the names of the siblings at all, or not even mention them. Like how many brothers and sisters did Jesus have? Like we know of one person's name, but we know there's more, but we don't know who they are, right? So if they weren't part of the story, because think about how big the Bible would be if God listed every family member, right, and told everything in it. So Shem, Ham, and Japheth is the way that's listed in the Bible, not the chronological birth. But anyway, the Bible tells us the rough measurements of the ark in cubits. Now, cubits is an interesting term because cubits, we have no idea exact measurement of a cubit, but based on historical evidence, what we've learned is a cubit was how you decide to measure from your elbow to your tip of your finger. Now, if I use my hand, cubit may be a little bit longer, but if we use someone else's hand, it may be a little bit shorter, like my wife's. I think hers has become to here, right? So you can imagine God saying, hey, make it this amount of cubits. He knew the size of Noah's arm. He knew how big to make it, right? But if someone was saying, hey, build this ark, and someone was going to replicate it, it may have been a bigger boat or a smaller boat based on their measurement of themselves. Now, as a kid, my dad used to tell me how to measure an inch. Use your thumb here, right? But that's not an inch. Mine is bigger than an inch, so it doesn't work that out. But my dad basically said, just use that as a guideline, or use your feet as a foot. My feet are bigger than a foot, especially when I have shoes on, right? But these are guidelines that we use, and that's what a cubit was. So he said 300 cubits long, 500 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. The volume of the ark comes about 1.5 million cubic feet. That's pretty big. It's about the third of the size of volume of the Titanic. Now, nowhere do we see God describing a sail, a rudder, a wheel, right? So remember the pictures you see of the kids' nursery? It's like a little pointed boat, and it's got a little rudder on the back, a little wheel on the front. Noah's up there like, right? It was just a big barge. Right? Think of the big barges we see. Now, there's a possibility it did have a point. So the point helps a boat when it's going through big waves, whatever. So it may not have been just a flat boat, but it didn't have a rudder to move through or some type of system. It was just designed to float. And so that was designed to do that way. Right? Traditionally, most scholars believe that it took Noah about 120 years to build it. I love listening to people that try to discount Noah. And they're like, you know, how did he build this boat all by himself? He doesn't know do that. Well, 120 years, you think, okay, I might be able to build a boat that big in 120 years, maybe. But also, he wasn't by himself. People say, oh, he had his kids. But yeah, he also had his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather. They were still alive at the time. So there's probably other cousins, right? Some other people around him that would have been around. So it maybe he had a crew of like 50 building an ark in 120 years. I don't know. He was the foreman standing up on a big ledge telling people, no, put that there. We don't know all that story. And so we can't take that part of the story out just because we don't hear it. But it makes sense then that Lamech wouldn't be sitting in a chair just watching his son build this big ark for 120 years, right? So the ark was designed to hold Noah's family and 2 of every kind of creature, 7 of the clean animals, and we don't really know how many of the clean animals there were, but typically clean animals would be sheep, goats, doves, those type of things. And so they would give them enough food to eat while they were on there, some meat through this time. But also at the end, they offered a sacrifice to God. So there would have been animals left over to offer sacrifice to God and still have a male and a female at the end so that way they could continue to reproduce. So a lot of animals. Now, when you look at animals, people say, well, how do they get in there like, 15 dogs? Well, he didn't get a species of every one. He would have taken 1 dog, a male and female, 1 cat. Well, maybe not cats because we don't need them. Probably a big tiger, right? Big tiger. And later on, we bred them into some little varmint that digs outside of our yard. But anyway, called a cat. But anyway, so cats never mentioned in the Bible. I'm not my fault, right? So, but I think about like termites. Like, did you get male and female termite? I don't know, just being funny. But these animals would have probably had reproduced while they're on the ark. If they were there over a year and 12 days. So they might have reproduced. So they had some babies while it was on the ark already. So we had this ability to understand that it didn't need every type of tiger or every type of bear or every type, so there's a scientists that have come up with how many kinds of animals there would be, and they could all fit on the ark. Pretty cool. So I don't know all that. I don't know all the genealogy, all that kind of stuff. But it's neat to how God did this, right? So the rain began, and the Bible says that they went in, male and female, all the flesh went in. And just as God commanded, then the Lord shut him in, as I was talking to Tate about. They were sealed in by God. Again, it was God who sealed them and saved them. So as they're in the ark there, and God just told all the animals, you two go, you two go. And can you imagine just like, okay, today's the day, and animals just start showing up. And Noah's like, okay, come here, bears, this is your spot. Come here, giraffes, this is your spot, right? Come here, Tyrannosaurus Rex, this is your spot. Yes, there were dinosaurs on the ark. Yeah, do some research on that one. It'll kind of blow your mind. Yes, there were dinosaurs. They could have been baby dinosaurs. They didn't have to be full grown, right? Alligators are a type of dinosaur. Lizards. We have all sorts of kind of dinosaurs that still live today. Now think about if mankind lived 1,000 years and a lizard or Komodo dragon lived 1,000 years, how big would that Komodo dragon be? Think about that, right? All right, so they're on there 40 days and 40 nights it rains, a global flood. People say, oh, it's only part of the earth. Okay, so the Bible says that it went up 22 feet over the highest mountain. right? God wanted to make sure that it was definitely deep enough that people weren't going to be able to climb up Mount Everest, right? Now, people have said, oh, well, if they went up that high, they wouldn't be able to breathe and have been cold because of lack of oxygen. Maybe the mountains weren't that tall back then, right? We don't know. A long time ago, when a flood makes mountains come up and all sorts of different things. In fact, they say some of the mountains are still rising even today. So 22 feet over whatever the highest mountain was, and how much is flood? That means it's a global flood. People say, well, it can't happen that way. God created the universe in 6 days, so I think he can make a flood happen, right? Don't argue with God. He said it happened. I believe it, right? People say, well, if I can prove it didn't happen, would that falter your thought of God? No, I just falter your view of what happened. But no, I believe it, so that doesn't really bother me, right? So after the rain stopped, Noah and his family had to wait for the waters to recede. They end up living the ark, again, 377 days. At some point, Noah opened the window and let a raven out. It said the Bible says that the raven flew in and out of the boat until the waters receded. Then a little bit later, he let a dove out. Anybody know how many times he let a dove out? Three times. Yeah. Most people say, oh, he let a dove out once. No, he let a dove out 3 times. Raven first, then the first dove. First dove came back. Good to go. All right. No water. Second time, 7 days later, let out. She comes back with an olive leaf. You've seen the picture of the dove with the olive leaf in its mouth. That's where we get that from, right? 7 days later, he lets a dove out the third time. Now, whether it's the same dove or not, we don't know, but he lets the dove go out. This time, the dove never comes back. He didn't reproduce. We don't know where he went, or she. She's gone somewhere, right? Never returned the ark. So then he kind of knew, okay, it's time. But Noah was sealed in by God, remember? So Noah's on the ark going, okay, we got a dove, didn't come back. Probably the waters receded. We feel that we're on ground, but is it enough for us to get out yet? We don't know yet. So he's just waiting. And eventually God says, Noah, today's the day. Let's go. Opens the door and all the animals start falling out. Right? God made a covenant with Noah and all living creatures, promising never to destroy the earth by flood again. And a rainbow was given as a sign of his covenant. He says, whenever I see this rainbow, I will remind myself not to flood the earth. That's what he says. It's also a promise to you that whenever you see the rainbow, that's a promise that God has made to you that he'll never flood the earth again. That's a kind of a cool promise. But interesting, the rainbow came after the rain. It had been stopped raining for like almost a year, right? We see the rainbow when the rain is beginning or right when the rain is moving off. It's over there, it's ended here, it's coming this way. But can you imagine sunny sky and see a rainbow? Can you imagine you see like maybe a couple clouds, but no rain, and God just has a rainbow up here? That's kind of cool to think about that, right? So God made a rainbow. Noah lived at 950 years old, not as old as Methuselah, 350 years after the flood, and he still didn't get to rest. He was making vineyards and getting drunk with wine. Read the story, it's fun. But after this, we start seeing mankind age gets lower and lower and lower. In fact, we see his sons not live that long, and then his grandkids not live that long, and they all kind of get shorter and shorter in their life. Now, these are interesting facts and good Bible knowledge, and we should know them. But what animals were on the ark, the size of the boat, what family he was from, what skills he learned, or even his outward righteous actions was not what the story was really about. This isn't his identity. And knowing them is not God's purpose for this event. And often we'll see people get in deep discussions and debates and arguments over the story of Noah about the facts that just really don't matter. It was a relationship Noah had with God, the inward heart of Noah that became his identity. He was God's child, and as a foreshadowing of our identity in Christ as well. Look at this wonderful verse, Genesis chapter 6, verse 8. It says, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Grace was given to him by God because of God's love for him. But what grace means, unmerited, unearned favor. Noah didn't do anything to find this grace. Hebrews tells us in Hebrews 11:7, by faith, Noah, being divinely warned about things not yet seen, right? Flooded the earth, moved with godly fear, and not fear like I'm scared of God, but godly fear is like an awness of God. He already knew God, so he said, yep, I'll do it. Prepared an ark to save his family, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Noah received righteousness by his faith. He learned of God and he found grace in the eyes of God, and he gained a strong faith because of his knowledge of who God is. It was by faith he received righteousness. It's because of this strong faith that he woke up each day being intentional about his relationship with God and his life with the soon to come Messiah. Now, how do we know this? How do we know that Noah was intentional? Because Noah would have had to be intentional about his obedience and his walk with God, because every day he had to get up and build this ark because a pending flood was coming. He was intentional because he had to build this ark in 120 days and have it ready for his family and the animals to live on. Any of us probably would have given up after 2 weeks, right? God, I'm building this ark. Doesn't seem like it's going very long. It's taken me forever just to get 4 pieces of wood made. Remember, we had to carve each one by, get the bark off and slice it by hand. We didn't have all these machines we have today. Every piece of wood had to be hand sawed with probably equipment that he had to make himself in order for it to work, right? Most of us would have given up, like, God, this is enough. That was a hard job you asked me to do. That's a hard job you put me in a task to do. That's hard people. People probably weren't even listening to him. Put that log there, and they put it somewhere else. He's like, these people you gave me, God. Right? But he didn't, yeah. But he didn't give up. He was intentional about his walk with God. He was intentional about his obedience to God. Intentional about his life with God. I think it's important for us to all understand how God views us. Because when we understand this, our walk with God becomes our focus. Our walk with God becomes intentional. Just like the intentional walk of Noah. So what is the focus of the story of Noah? Let's look at it from God's perspective. God begins by telling us how bad the world had become and how sad he was that man had turned away from God, his friend, and his creator. God created mankind, and mankind rejected this creator. God wanted to walk with mankind, and mankind didn't want to walk with him. He talks about how he thinks he will destroy all of man, all the animals, all the birds, and start over. This is sad to me for many reasons. But as a parent, I think about seeing my child reject me. My child turning away from me and never wanting to have anything to do with me ever again. How would you feel as a parent for that? And now multiply it by millions. And then knowing that because you were the Father creator and you created mankind to be your children, but also for them to worship you forever, that they were going to be separated from you for the rest of their life, and that the heartbreak that must have for God. And maybe in his mind when he said, I desire to get rid of mankind, maybe his thought was, I'll start over and do it a different way. You think about God and the process. I would say this, has it ever occurred to you that nothing occurs to God? He already knew the answers, but doesn't necessarily mean he didn't hurt anyway. He already knew what he was going to do, but it didn't mean he didn't hurt the pain. He knew when Adam and Eve fell, he knew what was going to happen. He knew a Messiah would have to come and that Messiah would die. So he knew all that ahead of time, but it doesn't mean it took away the hurt and pain. But he saw Noah. And he said, but Noah is righteous. And I give grace to Noah and his family. Then we come to this verse, a verse that precedes even the Bible's mention of Noah. Before what is going on to happen to him and before he will do for God. We read a little bit earlier, Genesis 6:8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So before we even know about Noah or the ark or anything, we see this verse. This is God saying, but I see Noah. And his faith in me has made him righteous. And my grace, even though he's messed up and even though he's probably done some things he shouldn't do, my grace is extended to him. Though he might not have been accepted in the eyes of men who mocked him and yelled at him, he was very accepted in the eyes of God. Though Peter calls him a preacher of righteousness and the writer of Hebrews lists him as a hall of faith, we know that Noah was not a perfect man, but otherwise he would not have had grace. He found grace, not on account of his own merit, on account of the mercy of God and the love of God. We know Noah wasn't sinless or perfect because he wouldn't have needed grace if he was. But it could be said that Noah had certain traits that drew the attention of God in his grace. These words are used when written about Noah. It says he's righteous, blameless, and he walked with God. And since the only man to receive grace at the time was the one man who demonstrates these traits, some people say, well, in order to receive grace, you must walk righteously. Because that's what Noah did. In fact, grace is never used in the entire Bible until this point right here. The first mention of grace is right there. So some people say, well, in order to receive grace, you must walk righteously. Well, that defeats the whole message of grace. Now, if you said, in order to receive mercy, you must be righteous, different story. But in order to receive God's grace, his amazing grace only happens because we are imperfect and we're not righteous. So it's not about our walk. It's not about our intentions. It's not about our desires, what we want. It's about God's love for us and all of mankind. Let me show you some interesting verse. After we read a little bit of Noah's life, his kids' names, and how bad the earth is, God tells Noah what he's going to do. He tells Noah he wants him to build an ark, a giant container that floats to carry all the animals. But Genesis 6:18 says, but I will establish my covenant with you. You must go into the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. I will establish my covenant. I think this verse in verse 6-8 about the grace of God are the best verses of this whole story of Noah. And I think it's where our focus needs to be drawn. Many will try to say, live your life like Noah, be intentional, be blameless, be perfect before God. But the reality is we can't. We can't live our life that way. And because we can't, Noah couldn't either. God would establish a covenant with him in spite of what Noah does. God made a covenant that brings salvation to Noah, a covenant that ultimately brings salvation to all of mankind. We can also see how the focus should be on God and his grace, not on Noah and his actions or the animals or the size of the ark, but by looking at every aspect of Noah's life. But look at another aspect of Noah's name. Remember we said earlier his name meant rest. We talked about earlier. In the beginning, after Adam had eaten of the fruit forbidden by God, God said to Adam, because you have eaten from the tree which I've commanded you, cursed is the ground on account of you. In hard labor you will eat of it all the days of your life. And then after Noah was born, his father Lamech said he will name Noah because he will bring us rest. But fast forward to after the flood, a year and 12 days after the rain and flood started, the earth is dried up. Noah finally left the ark. And this is what God told him, I will never again curse the ground because of man. Rest did not come through mankind. Rest did not come by Noah's actions. Rest does not come by who Noah is and his name. Rest comes only through God. The story of Noah, as well as other Bible stories, all point to the one who brings us rest, to the Messiah, to Christ, is yet to come and has now come now. It is the grace of God and the covenant that God makes with man that should always be the focus. Every story, every character of the Bible has a focus. It is not on man, and it's not on man's action. It is always on Christ and God's relationship for man. Look what we learn from the story if we focus on Christ and his love for all of mankind. Because of the righteousness of one, Christ, Noah and his whole family received grace that day. And you say, well, Christ hadn't come yet. All of the grace of the Old Testament was pointing to the Messiah that would come. Titus 2 tells us that the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men, which and includes Noah. To the family of Noah, Christ would be born. In Luke's account of the genealogical line of Christ, he lists Noah and his son Shem and the line of Christ. Noah and his family are so intertwined, and not just the family of Christ, but also the purpose of Messiah to come to bring grace to mankind. The first mention of grace in the Bible is a story of Noah, and all points to Christ, the Messiah, to bring grace. The story of Noah brings us a first mention, a direct correlation between Noah and the grace of Christ. The descendants of genealogical line from grace of God is a mirror image of grace. And in fact, if you look at the Hebrew spelling of Noah and the Hebrew spelling of grace, it's a mirror image of each other. The first letter of Noah is the second letter of grace, and the second letter of Noah is the first letter of grace. Grace is found in the eyes of God by Noah, and his name is a mirror image of it. Rest in the mirror image of grace, linked together for all eternity. Christ said, I will give you rest in my grace. So one who has rest is a direct mirror of the one who is grace. And Christ said, you want to have rest? You come learn of me. When you want to have peace in your life, you come learn of me. When you want comfort in your life, you come learn of me. The story of Noah is a mirror, a reflection of grace, and it is grace that brings us true rest and comfort. It's by grace we are saved, and this salvation brings rest and comfort through the power of the Holy Spirit. The spirit of comfort and of rest resides in every believer. The fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, is already in us. My hope is that you will never look at the story of Noah again without thinking of the grace of God. And hopefully you'll develop an eye for looking for God's grace in every single story of the Old Testament. And to keep a Christ as the focus, because Christ said all the prophets and all the previous writers spoke of me. That all pointed to Christ. So to keep Christ as a focus in every single story you read, every famous man, every famous woman in the Bible, read the story and find Christ in it, and you'll see him. Grace, grace, God's grace is marvelous, infinite, and matchless grace. Let's stand and worship God as we pray and sing together and glorify him because of his grace. Father God,